afternoon, everyone. It's Glen, Kyle with the Northeast Georgia History Center coming to you again via the Cottrell Digital Studio to take you on a brief tour of part of one of our exhibits. We know that people are perhaps trapped at home and wishing you could go out to see one of your favorite history museums, but we're going to do the best that we can to bring a history museum to you. So we're here in the main exhibit gallery at the Northeast Georgia History Center. The name of this exhibit is called Land of Promise. And it's called that because this is an exhibit about this region, a specific region of Northeast Georgia. And our idea is that people have been coming here because it is a land of promise. It offers things that everyone looks for when they're wanting to go somewhere else. There are natural resources, there are trade opportunities, there is beauty, there's new opportunity. So even in the prehistoric times, people would come to this region primarily at that point because of the rich natural resources. And we have a couple of cases here behind me today. I want to talk to you a little bit about the first inhabitants of this area, the very early Native Americans. And we're talking about going back thousands and thousands of years. And this is one of the great challenges when we talk about this period in history. This is technically what we call prehistoric. Now, we don't necessarily mean dinosaurs and things like that roaming around. What we mean is there is no written account of the past. There's no stories that were inscribed on paper or on stone or on clay tablets that tell us the story of these peoples. So what we have to depend on almost exclusively is the archaeological record, are things that we can find in the ground from aerial photography that tell us a little bit about what these cultures may have been like. So I'm going to show you some of these objects, but you have to keep in mind that what we see are really just the remnants of a very rich, very complex civilization, and it's the things that last over thousands of years, things like bone and stone and things like that. Their cloth, their leather items, they're not going to exist. So let's go ahead and start looking inside of this case. And inside of this case, you have some really neat artifacts. You have some pottery. Pottery is one of the great things we can use to look at how a culture might have lived. And we've gotten to the point technologically now where if we're really lucky, some of these pots, some of these clay pots may have remnants inside of them or some of the food that was actually cooked inside. Now, this was not dug up as you see it totally and unbroken. It was dug up in pieces and then it was put back together. And these are representations of the different kinds of Indian cultures. And again, we're talking about going back thousands and thousands of years, sometimes 10 to 13 to 15,000 years ago is when these items were created. And when we say created, of course, they didn't create the rock, but just like us, they would take the tools and the resources around them in the natural world and help them be modified to use in their culture. Here's a really neat piece. This is called a grinding stone. Now, the earliest Native Americans were what we call hunter-gatherers. They did not have agriculture. They did not put seeds into the ground and grow crops. They would go and they would hunt animals. They would gather what they could from the forest, and that's what they would eat. So things like seeds and nuts that they would gather around, they had to process them in some way so that they could consume them. And these rocks, they would just use the rocks to kind of grind them together and break them down into smaller pieces that they could put in water and perhaps boil and cook sort of as a stew or something like that. So you see the tools that they're using for some of their food ways and some of the ways that they would divide the labor between men and women and even kids. And you move on up to about 8,000 BC to the Archaic period. This is the time when you start to get things like spears and specific types of stone points. Now, we all think about arrowheads. Many of us have found arrowheads in our backyard or in our grandpa's fields or something like that. This is something we have gone a lot of trouble to try to interpret and decipher how these points were made. They're almost all made of flint because flint is a type of rock that when you strike it with another rock, flakes come off of it and it can be shaped to form very specific types of tools. And you see those points there, those are all made to go on the end of a stick. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a bow and arrow at this point. We're still talking about spears. And you see the work there. They're not just throwing the spears. They have a really interesting tool called an atlatl, ATL, that they used to give the spear a certain momentum. And when we get to the next case, I'll show you an example of that. But the types of pottery that we've dug up with the archaeological process, they start to change in the way they're designed, some of the designs that are there for artistic purposes on the outside, and sometimes the shapes of the bowls can tell us what different time periods they belong to. And it's important to know that the Native Americans in this area had, like I said, several thousands of years of evolutionary processes, and they became very complex civilizations. They had chiefdoms, they had workers, they had a religious class. They would build walled towns. Just not very far from here is the Etowah Mounds in Etowah, Georgia, and that's the remnant of a very complex society. And they would, by this point, they had gotten to agriculture, and the agriculture primarily consisted of what we call the three sisters. The Native Americans called it this too: squash, beans, and corn. They would plant all of these seeds together in one mound, and the corn stalk would grow, and it would grow tall, and the leaves would spread out from the corn and cover and give shade to the squash so that it could grow. And the beans, of course, the bean vines would wind around those corn stalks, and the beans would be able to flourish too. So those were the three staple crops of Native American agriculture from some of the earliest times right up until first contact with Europeans. Let's go ahead and move to this other case, and you can get some more details on the different types of tools and items that would be created. Now, like I said, they're taking the resources, the natural resources from their environment, and they're turning them into things they can use. And it takes a very specially trained eye. I'm not this good, but there are great archaeologists out there who have studied this sort of thing and can pick up a rock, and they can tell by the way it's been shaped, the way it's been handled, the way it might have an edge on it, that it was developed as a tool. And so you can see a lot of these different stones have been shaped. Here on the left you have an axe. You see those grooves towards the back of it and how it sort of comes down to a point. They would have taken a large stick, split it in two, and put this axe head in it. That's what they would have used to cut down other trees. And adze to shape wood. This hoe, they would have also attached that to a stick and used that for their agriculture. Over here is one of those, the atlatls I was telling you about. Now the stick is a reproduction. We didn't find that when we were doing these digs, but we did find the things that go on the end of them. The end up at the top is a horn piece, and it has a weight, a stone weight in the middle, and you could take that spear and hook the back of it onto that hook, and it would allow that spear to be thrown a little bit further and a little bit harder. We have here a cooking stone. These stones were used to heat some of the water. You could take the stones and put them in the fire, and when they got hot enough, you could drop that into the water, and it would heat the water up. You see over here some much larger stone points. These are pretty big, actually. These we think these might have been used for ceremonial purposes. You can see how large they are. And down here you have some clay pipes. And with these you can really see how detailed and intricate some of the workmanship from these Native Americans could be. And these were all used to smoke tobacco, which of course was a New World product and something that eventually was transferred to the Europeans. We also know a little bit about how they played. We see these stones up here. These are called chunky stones. And it was a nearly universal type of game that was played by the early Native Americans. And we think there were a couple of different variations. They would take these stones. You can see they're sort of wheel-shaped, and they could roll those stones, and then they would throw spears to either try to hit the stone or perhaps take a chance and try to throw the spear where they thought the chunky stone would stop rolling. So it's you can see and this would be very popular sporting events that people would come to watch. Very complex societies. So really the question is, what happened to those societies? Well, we had a little bit of a talk the other day about the role of disease in history. And what happened was European contact. And when the Europeans came into this area, we know that they were able to leave diseases like cholera and typhus and smallpox behind, and this absolutely destroyed these really complex civilizations. When these complex civilizations started to go away, because you see an incredible loss of people, 90%, we think, about 90% of the Native American population in these cultures died out because of that exposure. And this happened in a very short time, in less than a century. And so what happens is certain types of cultures grow up out of those leftover peoples that don't have that civilization anymore, and they form new types of cultures, much more localized, much more tribal, and those are the ones we think of today, the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, and we'll talk about the Choctaws a little bit and the Cherokee a little bit more in a moment. Yes, do we have a question?
We have a question from Roseanne Kent. She's wondering, is the hole in the cooking stone so you can lower it into the water?
That's exactly what it is. So that the hole in the stone, you could put the stone in the fire and you could perhaps use a piece of leather thong or probably a stick. And when it's warm enough for you, you could just take that stick, kind of scoop up the stone and then drop it into the water. And then when it cools down, you just take the stone out, put it back into the fire and reheat it. So again, a very practical tool, but notice that hole they had to put there. That's not something that's naturally occurring. So when they're developing this as a tool, they have to take the time and use other stones to put that hole inside of it. All right? So with the new Native American tribes that grow out of this, about this time is when they really come into significant European colonization, especially in this area. At first, the Spanish, a little bit of French, but it really kicks in when the colony of Georgia is founded in 1733, and the English begin to settle into what is now Georgia. And when they do that, they bring with them a lot of different European customs and a lot of new tools, a lot of new worldviews, a lot of new ways to do things. And the cultures, the Native American cultures and these European cultures, start to interact. So let's move to this case, and we'll take a look at some of the things that these Europeans brought with them. Now, probably one of the more significant things that Europeans bring along are firearms, and you have a firearm up here. This is a little bit later. This is around the 1840s or 50s. Muzzle-loading gun, but gunpowder weapons are something that come to the Cherokee and to this part of the state very early on. It's one of the main trade items that the Cherokee and all the Native American tribes want to get a hold of. It helps them gain power over their neighboring tribes, and it allows them to hunt deer and other types of animals much more effectively than bows and arrows. The Europeans also bring with them woven cloth. Now this is a beautiful coverlet that was made to go over a bed to provide warmth. It's different than a blanket, it's more homemade, but you can see these beautiful and intricate patterns. Weaving cloth was something that the Europeans did bring with them, and it was very quickly picked up by the Native Americans. But there's also still some somewhat primitive tools that they would use in the kitchen, like this bread trough. This wooden bowl can be made on site. It can be made by someone, but it's still the perfect tool to kind of roll the dough to make your bread. Europeans bring with them iron tools like this iron pot. We saw that clay pot over there, right? And it had lasted, but it had been in the ground, it had been broken, and if you hold a clay pot and you drop it, it's probably going to break. Iron pots are much more durable. They conduct heat much more effectively. You don't have to drop stones in to heat the water up anymore. You can just set this over the fire and nothing's going to happen to it. European settlers also bring in log cabins. But they're still doing the same thing. They're taking the natural resources around them and they're using them and they're modifying them to suit their way of life and make their life better. And log cabins, very interesting history. They probably came from the Dutch and worked their way down from New England, but all you need to make even a basic shelter is an axe and maybe a saw and a whole lot of trees. If you have that, even one person, but it helps if you have two or three, can go and make a shelter with a roof, with a fire that you can live in, you can cook in, you can keep warm in the winter, you can keep your supplies in and keep them safe from the animals and from the elements. Very, very important how these cabins were made and how the land was cleared. We'll come back to that in a second as well. But there's also still some artistry. You saw the clay pots from the Native Americans. They're very beautiful, and they have those beautiful, intricate designs on them. Still happens with the Europeans. Here's a great example. This little wooden thing here, it kind of looks like a cup. What that is a butter mold. So they've domesticated animals, especially cows, and they take the milk from the cows and they make butter. You make butter because it's a great way to preserve the milk, right? If you take a glass of milk and you leave it out, it's going to go bad in just a few hours. But if you turn it into butter and keep it cool, that milk will last for weeks and weeks. But you don't just want a blob of butter, you kind of want to make it pretty. So this butter mold, you could take the butter and put it in there, and then it would press upon it this beautiful little design, just adding something nice and artistic to what could be just a boring everyday thing, just like the coverlet, right? They're trying to make an artistic expression of who they are and of their culture. Now, one of the things that happens with the settlers is they keep moving into the Native American areas, they realize that there are resources there that they want. The Spanish, when they first came to the New World, were really looking for one thing. They were looking for gold and silver, because that's the quick way to get rich, and that's the best natural resource you can extract from an area, because it gives you great wealth just like that, right? Land, crops, trees, resources like that take a lot of labor and they take a lot of time, but gold and silver gets you rich quick. Just north of here in Dahlonega, Georgia, gold was discovered in this area about 1828. And when gold was discovered, lots of people came here to get the gold out of the ground, because again, that's how you get rich quick. So we can sort of scoot down this way and see some of the basic tools that the miners would use in this region. What they have first is called placer mining. This is what we think of when we think of old-timey gold miners. They take a pan, they take picks and shovels, and they wade out into the stream, right? And they start kind of digging in the dirt, trying to find those nuggets that show up. That's called placer mining, because you're just in place. That's how people start out. But even here and later on in San Francisco, when they have the great 49 gold rush, it becomes much more industrialized and much more of a business. People come in with machines, with labor, and they start actually going into the ground and employing technology to scoop up with hydraulic mines, with hydraulic pumps and water, as much of that dirt out of the way as they can get, so they can get to the gold. That's a little ahead of us for right now, but when gold's discovered here, it sort of accelerates the process of the Europeans and now the Americans, from the citizens of the United States, wanting to take the lands from the Native Americans. It's all about getting the land. And we don't have an original here, but you can sort of see this picture of a gold coin. So there was so much gold in this area that people were setting up private places, not just government mints, but private mints where you could make money out of the gold that you found. And one of those was Templeton Reed, and right here in Gainesville, Georgia, he set up a mint where he would take your gold and turn it into coins, usually of $2.50, $5, and $10 value. He did not stay in business very long, but what that means today is that these Templeton Reed coins have become some of the most valuable coins to collectors in the entire world, because he didn't make very many of them, and there's a lot of gold in them. So if you're a collector, I think one of the last ones that was on auction sold for a little over $1 million. That's why we don't have one here on display. We can't afford that. But if you have one, please send it to us and we'll give it a place of honor in our collection. Now, I've talked a little bit about the Cherokee and the Native Americans. Let me, unless we have a question, let's do a question first.
Emma, who is 11, would like to know the type of houses Native Americans in this region lived in.
That is an excellent question, Emma. In this region, early on, we're talking about pre-European contact, they would have sort of thatched huts. They would take trees and sort of weave the branches together, and then take hay and other things and sort of make them into a hut. As time goes by, they develop other types of housing, and they adopt a lot of European-style housing. We actually have here on our site a cabin that was built by a Cherokee family around the very, very early 1800s, just like this log cabin. And so it sort of depends upon which point in Native American history you're talking about. I will tell you that in this region, we did not have teepees. I know most people associate teepees, the big, tall, conical tents, with Native Americans, but that is very much a Plains Indian type of home and type of structure. Here in Northeast Georgia, there are no teepees. You see the thatched huts, and you see them again because there's a lot of cultural exchange between the Europeans and between the Cherokees. So they start to adopt a lot of those European methods of living and of farming. And so you see a lot of Cherokee who began to build houses just like this. So that's a good segue. Let's talk a little bit about the Cherokee. We're going to sort of pivot way around here and look at some of these traditional Cherokee clothes. And we have here some traditional Cherokee clothing, both male and female. And this is in a very transitory stage. This is circa 1810s to 1820s, right around the peak of the Cherokee National Council, National Tribe here in North Georgia. But you can see there are parts of the clothing that reflect both the Native American and the European. First of all, it's cloth. Native Americans began to trade for cloth, for needles, for thread, for wool, for things to make clothing out of. That sort of increased their dependence upon the trade of goods that they would get, and usually those goods were deerskins. But we also have very, very decorative motifs. This is one of my favorite pieces. This is a traditional Cherokee bag, and I don't know how close you can zoom in, Libba, but this is beadwork, right? This is beautiful individual beadwork that represents a lot of artistry and a lot of effort that they would put into making something not only beautiful, but that would reflect themselves and would reflect their culture. Now, he also has this, what we call a gorget, sort of a silver or a brass piece of metal that would be worn around the neck. That was very traditionally European officers' rank insignia, but Native Americans also adopted that sort of as a decorative form. The women's clothing is much more simple. It's just an overshirt with a skirt, but even the skirt, you can still see some of the beadwork and some of the ribbon work that would be along the bottom of it. We have a spinning wheel here to show that the Cherokee had actually adopted methods of producing cloth and sewing cloth like this. But it's really interesting because one of the things with the Cherokee, by the time you get to where we are here in Gainesville, Georgia, and the founding of the town in the 1820s, the Cherokee had very much acculturated. They had become very, very Europeanized, I suppose, for lack of a better word. And this is the traditional Cherokee dress, but just as many Cherokee are going to be dressed as the average European or American man or woman walking down the street here in Gainesville. This is very traditional and would almost, depending upon which part of the Cherokee you belong to, might have been seen as backwards, because the Cherokee were very forward-looking. They were trying to show that they were a sovereign and independent nation and had adopted a lot of the things that Americans had adopted. We have a question?
Do you know what they used as a needle to do the sewing and beadwork?
Well, in this case, they just used an iron needle and thread. And a lot of these beads are glass beads, which they would again get in trade. So even though they're creating something that's distinctly Cherokee, they're doing it with materials that would be traded for, such as, like I said, the deerskin. They're still trading for those. And so it creates this dependency on things, right?
And did they ever wear furs, like bear or deer?
By this time period, that was pretty uncommon. They might have some deer and some fur sort of as an accent, maybe around the turban that they would wear on their head, but not really by this point. Earlier on, in some of the earlier, like the Mississippian and the very early Cherokee and Creek cultures around the early 1700s, you would see a lot more fur and deer.
Can you speak to the risk of being attacked by animals? Jessica Martin says, my boys in Minnesota want to know how likely was it for animal attacks to harm or kill a native?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the exact answer to that. I can sort of I'm trying to think of some of the original sources I've heard. Probably it was not great. It was not as significant. I know out west there are grizzlies and things like that closer to there where you're at, and grizzly attacks are something that the Native Americans and the Europeans who moved in that area certainly had to worry about. We don't have any critters quite that big around here. I think from a natural perspective, most of the danger probably came from things like poisonous snakes, or infestations that would harm crops or something like that. There are, of course, bears, in this area, but they're black bears. They're significantly smaller than some of those western bears, like grizzlies and things like that. So let's move over to here, and we can see some more of these traditional Cherokee arts and crafts that don't necessarily depend upon European trade and trade items. And these are very, very traditional and beautiful Cherokee items. There's Cherokee Basketry, and the creation of Cherokee Basketry was very much a part of women's work. I'm using quotes, but women took a great amount of pride in the type of basketry they were able to make, and it sort of brought women together. And it was sort of, this is a little bit of a stretch, but it was sort of the Native American version of a quilting bee. Lots of ladies in the area, in the town, would get together. They would go gather the items for the baskets. They would make the baskets. They would trade the baskets. And as you can see, these are very beautiful, and they're very sturdy. Yes, another question.
Jackson, who is 7, wants to know, what did Native Americans trade to get the items they used for bags and clothes?
That's a good question. We're probably going to do a program soon about that, but in one word, it's deerskin. So starting as far back as the late 1600s, Europeans wanted deerskin because it was smooth, it was supple, it was a great item for fashion, and they could use it in Europe for shoes, for gloves, for hats, for animal harnesses and things like that. So it became incredibly popular, and people wanted more and more of it. And the best source to get that from was from North America. And the best way to get it out of North America was to trade with Native Americans, because Native Americans could take the firearms that were traded to them, go out, hunt the deer, kill the deer, tan the hides, and bring them back at the end of a season and trade for all these goods, for clothing, for more gunpowder, for more weapons, for iron pots, things like that. And so it increased a dependency, but you also have to think about the amount of deerskins that were being traded. One single Cherokee hunter over a season could probably kill and have about 60 hides to trade. And you're talking about thousands of men who are taking part in this. And so, for example, by about 1750, about 1 million deerskin hides were leaving the New World and going to England in 1 year. So that is a huge amount of trade, and there's a lot of trade going on, and it's bringing a lot of different goods from Europe. So that's a good question. Let's see, up top we have a blowgun and a blow dart. Now, these were not used in war, and I can tell you I have a reproduction. They're kind of fun to use, but they're used for small game like squirrels and rabbits and things like that. There's also a traditional bow and arrow back there, and the Cherokee initially started using the bows and arrows to hunt the deer, to get the deer skin, but then they quickly realized that they were able to be much more effective and much more efficient with a musket or with a rifle than they were with this bow and arrow. So they almost abandoned the bow and the arrow as a weapon of war and of hunting. And you see down here, there's also 2 sticks and a ball, and this has a couple of different names, but the best translation is Little Brother of War. And it's sort of evolved into what today we call lacrosse, but back then it was much more violent. The games lasted a lot longer, and it could get pretty rough. People were being elbowed and thrown and kicked and pushed, trying to get the ball into a specific target or thrown into just an upright log. People didn't get mad at each other, though, apparently, because they just felt that this was a way to prove their manhood, to get good exercise, to show off in front of their friends and family and maybe their girlfriends. But they didn't get angry about it. Even if there were broken arms and bloody noses, they just continued to play this because it made them tough. And again, it wasn't warfare. It was the little brother of war. It wasn't filled with anger, but it was certainly filled with a kind of courage and physical activity. But these great Cherokee arts and crafts and abilities started to go away. And the bows and arrows started to go away because they had become, by this point, so dependent upon the trade that they didn't do the old stuff anymore. So in just a couple of generations, Cherokee and Creek culture fundamentally changed. Men's roles, women's roles, all began to shift to accommodate the deerskin trade. Of course, this caused a huge crisis in identity. It made the Cherokee wonder where they fit with each other. It made them wonder where they fit in with the new United States. And it really caused a lot of issues even within the Cherokee Nation. And within the Cherokee Nation, there was a lot of division when the United States, under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, began to move towards removing all of the Indians east of the Mississippi, picking them up and taking them west of the Mississippi so that those lands could open up for settlement from Europeans. We're not going to get into that right now because next week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we have a great three-part series we're going to be doing to highlight the issues of removal and some first-person interpretation of what it was like to be amongst those Native American tribes as they were being removed. So let's go ahead and scoot over here. And you see here, I talked about European settlers moving in to get the land and to build houses and grow crops. It's hard for us to imagine today, but imagine almost the entire North American continent being covered up with trees and forest. There almost is no empty land. So even if you get the land as a European settler, you still have to go there, you have to build your house, and you have to clear the land to make room to grow crops. That's an important part of it, and these are the tools that they would use to build their houses, clear the land, and basically build a farm out of the wilderness. You've got saws. This big saw that's here in the middle, you notice it has a handle on two ends. That's so that two people could sort of push back and forth and cut the big logs. These big axes, there are different kinds of axes to do different kinds of cuts on the logs. This, of course, is called a felling axe because it's what you use to fell a tree, to cut down a tree, so it falls, right? So it's a felling axe. This big broad axe right here, you see how long that blade is. That's to it's called hewing the log. You would use that on the edge of the round log and make that side flat, and then you would turn it and make that side flat, and eventually what you have is a square log. And the cabin we have outside is made of hewn logs. Of course, we have a hoe here. That's an incredibly common agricultural tool that helps you weed things. Smaller saws. Let's see. This is called a maul. And this wedge, you would use that to split logs and maybe make fences or make your pieces for your roof on your cabin and things like that. So, building the cabin, getting the land ready to farm. Notice that there's no gasoline engines attached to these, right? This is all handwork. This is a world it's a 3-mile-per-hour world, and every single thing is muscle powered. Everything, right? Whether it's a horse muscle or a person muscle, the saws, the wagons, the plows are all pulled, they're all operated by a living creature moving and making things work, which is one of the things that makes food so important, right? One of the main focuses is to grow food so that you can eat, so that you can continue to work. That is something that you all have to remember because we have so many labor-saving devices nowadays. But on the frontier, for for the Europeans, for the Native Americans. Everything has to be done by hand and with muscles. A question?
We have a question. Let's see. How far did they go in terms of hunting? Joshua, age 10, wants to know.
Oh, I'm assuming you mean for the deerskin? At first, they didn't have to go very far because there were plenty of deer within just a couple of days' ride of where they actually live. So you wouldn't have to go out very far. But of course, if there are thousands of people hunting deer and you're killing 1 million deer a year to export to England, to send to England, the deer are eventually going to start to run out, and this causes a big environmental issue. So the longer the deerskin trade goes on, the further out you're having to go to hunt the deer. And this causes problems between the different Indian tribes, because if the Cherokee are hunting the deer in their land and the Creek are hunting the deer in their land, that's fine. But if they have to go further and further to get the deer, they're going to start bumping into each other and going into each other's territory. That causes a lot of trouble. Another question.
How long did it take to build a cabin by hand?
That sort of depends upon how many people you had to help you. One of the important things to remember is that wood, trees, are living things, and the wood can expand and contract based on the season, based on how recently it's been cut down. So ideally, you would be able to go out, cut down a lot of trees, and then leave them there to season for 6 to 8 months. You might go off somewhere and then come back, then start building the cabin. Sometimes you didn't have time, so you would cut down some trees. You would build a very, very basic cabin just to live in while you worked on the trees to get a really nice cabin. Now, to directly answer your question, if you're just trying to get a cabin, and most of the cabins were about 16 by 20, if you had, let's say 2 men, let's say 3 men, because you would have neighbors and maybe a son to help you. With 3 men building a cabin, you could probably get it done in a very basic way in 3 weeks, maybe a month. That's a lot of back-breaking work, and that's having the proper tools there, to do it. You need ropes to kind of pull those taller logs up onto the other ones. There are some great YouTube videos about folks who have gone out and built cabins in a traditional way. So once this video is over, if you have time, but not until this one's over, get on YouTube and take a look and just look up building a cabin, and there's probably several good videos you can take a look at where people can go into more detail about it. It's a really fascinating topic, and I wish that I had time to just go out into the woods and make one, because it looks like a lot of fun, but I bet there's a lot of busted fingers and sore muscles involved. All right, so let's scoot over this way. Now, this is our mule. He's not a real mule, he's a plastic mule, but we have him here to sort of show folks how big one of the draft animals to be used on a farm was, to sort of show you how the harness could be hooked up. And we have behind it here a wagon. And in the wagon, we have a gentleman dressed in typical frontier fashion. This is how someone would have been dressed here in Gainesville about the time of the founding of the city in 1820, 1830. And remember, I said earlier that a lot of Cherokee would have adopted European or American style dress. This is it. It looks kind of fancy. It looks like there may be a top hat and a tailcoat, but remember, this was the average and usual clothing of the time. And here's some of that muscle I was talking about that does all the work. And you can, I don't know how many folks have actually been around a mule or a horse, but they are big creatures, and to keep them healthy, it takes a lot of water, takes a lot of hay, and it takes a lot of feed to keep that muscle going. So it's not just about the food that you're going to keep your family alive, it's about the food to keep your mules alive and your cows and your chickens and things like that. So it's an important part of an everyday life on the farm. Now you see he also has a rifle next to him. Now folks are going to be, carrying weapons with them a lot of times, not to fight each other usually, but again, if they need to go hunting, if they need to protect themselves from some of those animals that our question was about, he's going to have this available. But usually for hunting, because meat from a deer or something like that is going to be a great way to supplement what you grow. Meat provides a lot of protein, and it's a lot quicker to get that kind of food than it is to spend an entire summer season growing food out of the ground, right? You have to do both. But hunting is a great way to get a lot of meat very quickly, and folks had a very, very practical approach to preserving meat and to preserving the food that they did have. And that's an important thing to remember too, is that a lot of the jobs involved with food production also means food preservation, right? They have to smoke the meat so that it lasts a long time. They have to take the dairy products like milk and turn it into butter. They have to turn it into cheese to make it last a long time. They have to dry the fruits and vegetables to make them last a long time. So it's a really interesting process how people used to eat. We should do another one of those presentations. Now, in this time period, it's important to remember that this is pre-Civil War. This is what we've really been talking about is from prehistory. We've focused on sort of the late 1700s and early 1800s, and we're up now to about the 1830s or so. We've had the gold rush. The Native Americans have been removed, and they've gone west. But there's still a lot of land to work, and there's still a lot of families that want to work that land. And in this time period, in the United States, slavery does exist. Enslaved Africans have been brought over for a couple, 300 years, and they are used to work the land. Again, if everything's muscle-powered, to make things effective, you have to have as much muscle as possible to make things go, right? So it's very unfortunate that these people's entire lives are centered around working for someone else, and they're someone's property. And you have to remember that perspective, that is not a very pleasant way to live, and thousands of people had to live that way. And when thousands of people live that way, it sort of enters the culture. But I don't want you to think that enslaved people were absolutely miserable all the time. They had a lot of agency with themselves. By that I mean that they could choose to interact with their families. They could choose with their friends. And a lot of times they developed relationships with both white people and other African people that was very, very unique. And a lot of the farms in this area that did employ slavery were not big plantations, right? Because the topography, this is a very mountainous region. There are not big flat areas to have a lot of agriculture. So a lot of the work of slaves would be just the exact same as the farmers that they would be working with. They would be working side by side in the fields with the farmers who owned them. But there's a lot of neat stories about African Americans in this time who were able to escape. They were able to buy their freedom. When I was talking about the gold rush earlier, there was a gentleman who found some gold, and he was able to purchase his freedom. And rather than running to the north or something like that, as soon as he got his freedom, he had some money left over, and he opens a store in Dahlonega where the gold rush really is sort of becoming central. And for a while, he does pretty well because he has a very successful store. And so this interaction between enslaved African Americans and Native Americans and European Americans creates a really unique culture in this area that makes it one of the more historically interesting places. It has a lot of different aspects of everyday life. It has a lot of aspects of national history, and it speaks a lot to how so many people can interact in so many different ways on both an individual level and a larger cultural level. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, we have someone curious about what is the metal on the horse? I think we have a student maybe.
Oh, let's see.
The metal part? Probably just the harness, right?
The metal. Let's see. Are you talking about I'm going to assume you're talking about like these?
I think
So let me kind of give you a really quick rundown of how hooking up a mule or a horse to a wagon works. So you have the wagon, and you have the tongue right here, right? This is attached to the wagon, and it goes up this way. Now, the horse has to pull the wagon somehow. It can't take its hands and get a hold of the straps and pull like that. The strongest way to do that is this collar, right? This collar sort of slips on the mule's head this way, and it rests on its shoulders, right here on its shoulders. And you can kind of see here, this is made of leather, but it's got padding on the inside of it, like hair or a straw or something like that, so that there's a little bit of padding. And these chains hook up and go through here and actually connect to the tongue back here. So that when he says giddy up and that horse starts to pull, what really is making the wagon move is the horse pulling with its shoulders, pulling back on this part of the wagon. And of course, this is connected to the wagon underneath. And the front wheels can pivot left and right, to just like a car today, to kind of allow the wagon to make left and right turns and things like that. What this does mean, however, if this entire setup is made to pull, it makes it very, very difficult to back up. Wagons don't usually back up. They have to go forward or turn left or right. And while we're on how a wagon works, let me show you too. Wagons did have brakes, right? Now this brake wasn't necessarily when you were going, you would pull this back and make the wagon stop. This is when the wagon's already stopped and you don't want it to go anywhere. You can pull this back. Let me know if you can kind of zoom in on those teeth. You pull this back and lock it into those teeth, and it pushes onto the wheels and locks those wheels in place so that the wagon can't move. So it's not really a driving brake. It's what we today in a car call an emergency brake or a parking brake. That's how that works. Those are some good questions. Do you have any more? Well, I think we've done enough today. I appreciate you being with us all this time and letting me show you the first part of our Land of Promise gallery. We've got a whole other rest of the gallery to go to bring us up to the present day. Hope you'll be able to continue joining us here at the Northeast Georgia History Center at the Cottrell Digital Studio. And if you can give any support to us to keep these things going, to keep getting the message out, and to keep all of you staying at home, please consider doing that. You can go to our website. But until then, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.